Good morning, everybody, and welcome to IDEA's webinar on public procurement and the role of direct negotiation. My name is Lawrence Todd. I'm the Director of Research at IDEAS, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to our session this morning. Thank you very much for joining us, and thank you very much to our panelists for joining us also. The purpose of today's session is to discuss public procurement and specifically the role of direct negotiation. So I think we can all agree that public procurement is an issue that continues to be a very high profile in the public policy space. It's an issue that raises questions over taxpayer value for money, over development of local industry, over risks of corruption and patronage. And so I think it touches on the interests of all different groups, whether that's government, taxpayers, citizens, and businesses, both local and international. So I think public procurement, for that reason, is a subject that continues to be subject for debate. And we at IDEAS have worked extensively on public procurement for several years now. And I'm very pleased that we have three panelists today to help us unpack the issues who have each individually their own experience of dealing with the public procurement system. Now, within public procurement, one of the most controversial and challenging issues is that of direct negotiation. But direct negotiation is used often as a tool in times of urgency or in cases of national security in order to expedite the public procurement process, whereby the usual process of tender is set aside in order to select and negotiate with an individual company to provide the relevant goods or service or public works. Now, I think we have seen both internationally and in our own experience in Malaysia that direct negotiation can often be, a source of challenge in terms of the heightened risk of corruption due to the uncompetitive nature of the negotiation, but also generally to other issues in the public procurement system, such as mismanagement or poor value for money. Now, there are mechanisms in place to govern direct negotiation in Malaysia, as we'll discuss this morning. But the questions I think we want to discuss today are those mechanisms adequate, and what more could we do to strengthen the position of direct negotiation? I think we all recognize that there are necessary cases. There is a necessity for some form of direct negotiation, and procurement systems all around the world have to find their own ways to accommodate that. But the discussion we want to have this morning is how best we can improve that in Malaysia. And now the context for that discussion is our hope and expectation that the government will proceed with the commitment that was set forth in the National Anti-Corruption Plan published last year to move forward with the Government Procurement Act to strengthen the legislative framework for public procurement, which is now primarily governed through administrative circular. The National Anti-Corruption Plan was, of course, launched under the Pakatan Harapan government, but the current government has indicated its commitment to see through those proposals. Introducing a Government Procurement Act was something that we and many other external civil society organizations and other NGOs strongly welcomed. So we sincerely hope to see that commitment implemented. And we hope that this webinar and the policy paper that accompanies it serves as a constructive contribution to the policy-making process as that legislation develops. So this morning, we will be discussing the issue of direct negotiation as I've laid out, and this will be based on a policy paper that's been prepared by our public finance team at IDEAS, which has been based on analysis of Auditor General reports and a series of roundtables held with different public procurement experts and stakeholders, both in the private sector, within government, and also within academia. So shortly, I'll be inviting our public finance unit manager, Sri Murniati, we call her Uni, to present those policy conclusions and findings. And then I'll be very pleased to introduce the discussion with our esteemed panel, which represent a range of different interests from ministerial to civil service to the external and also within government. So I think we have the full range of expertise we need to unpack these issues. Please feel free to share any questions or comments in the Q&A box or in the chat. If it's a question you want me to pick up for the panelists, then please put it in the Q&A. It's a little bit easier for me to manage that way. I will try to cover everything that people do raise, but apologies in advance if I'm not able to get to everything. YB has to leave us at 11:30, so I'll try to make sure that we hear enough from him. And as sure as you can understand, he's very busy at the moment, so we're very grateful for him for taking the time to speak with us this morning. Okay, on that note, I'm going to pass now to my colleague Sri Murniati, who is the manager of our public finance unit, to present our policy paper on public procurement and the role of direct negotiation. Over to you, Uni.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm going to share some slides to accompany my presentation today. Hold on. Yeah. Is it? Yeah. So I think as mentioned earlier by Lawrence, that direct negotiations, I think, is probably the only procurement method that has negative connotations. It's been associated with abuse, and it's been perceived to be prone to abuse. And actually, and in that way, it has been perceived to be having less possibility of delivering the best value for taxpayers' money. And it seems that directly negotiated contracts in AG reports, for example, seems to confirm this perception. When scandals about direct negotiation came up, I think some of us, or many of us, asked these questions. Don't we have regulations on direct negotiations? What's wrong with these rules? Are they not adequate, or it's simply a problem of compliance? So with these questions in mind, my team and I embarked on a research project about 4 months ago to understand what are the strengths and weaknesses of the current regulations of direct negotiations, and also to understand how these regulations are being practiced. So we looked into the circulars that are being practiced now, and then we also went through Auditor General reports from 2014 to 2018 to see the implementations of these rules. So I'm very glad that the papers is finally ready, and I'm very honored to share the findings today with the 3 esteemed panelists here, and of course with all of you, the audience. So without further delay, I'm just going to touch like 3 main topics of the paper. So what are the strengths and weakness of the current direct negotiation rules? And the second one, then I will be discussing how they are implemented. And the last one, for recommendations and how can they be improved. So let's see what are the strengths of the weaknesses of the current direct negotiation rules. So as of this year, there are 2 main circulars, treasury circulars that regulate direct negotiations. The first is PK, or Perolehan Kerajaan 715. These circulars provide guidelines to the agencies, ministries, or procuring authorities in general to submit application to the MOF. So direct negotiation should be done with MOF approval. And these circulars provide the guidelines to submit the application. The second circulars is the circulars PK 716. And this one is the circulars to guide the procuring authorities on how to do negotiation or price negotiation with the appointed companies. So in general, these 2 circulars provide quite adequate measures to ensure direct negotiations are carried out with accountability and deliver value for money. For example, I think it's been mentioned by Lawrence earlier that direct negotiations is a special method of procurement, and it can only be used in these 5 conditions. So one is urgency. I think the circular defined urgency as any condition that require expedited service delivery. So if the procurement exercise are not done fast enough, it will jeopardize public services. So the second one is standardizations. If the government, say, for example, has already some equipment for certain brands and they need to, in order to maintain it regularly and easily, they need to continue procuring the same brand or the same equipment. So for this purpose, they are allowed to negotiate directly with the suppliers of that current equipment. I think a lot of it, say, I think in defense, in health equipment, this kind of needs is actually there. So the third condition is the project, any project that involve the interest of security interests of the states. Again, I think this is very much about defense. So certain, of course, procurement of defense equipment has to remain secret to protect the interests of the country. The fourth condition is single source or expertise. So there are certain, I think there are complicated procurement services and goods that can only be supplied by one particular company. Hold on. So in this situation, procuring authorities, agencies can also do direct negotiation with one company. And the last one, I think this is consistent with the procurement policy, single Bumiputra manufacturer. So if there is single Bumiputra manufacturer for certain goods, so this company will be prioritized and the procuring authorities can directly negotiate with them. So it's very, I think the conditions is laid out there. So that's, I think, one of the important measures to ensure that not any goods or services or works can be done through direct negotiations. I think I'm going to discuss a little bit about how actually the process of approval or the entire process of direct negotiation procurement. So this is the process. So in general, there are two major process. The first one is approval process, and the second is price negotiation process. So for an agency to start the direct negotiation process is first they have to submit application to the MOF. For this purpose, they have to submit documents that show that the company that they appointed is qualified. So in terms of technical qualification as well as financial qualification. So for their purpose, they need to form an assessment committee. So this assessment committee have, of course, technical expertise, know that this company is actually qualified to do the job. Then the application, and they also have to provide scope of the project, so they know in advance what kind of project that they actually want. So then they submit the application to the MOF. So this, I think, the assessment committee is actually another measures to ensure that the direct negotiation deliver values for money. The second process is so after the application approved, then the procuring authorities can start negotiation with the appointed company. I think this is another layer of process that is quite good to ensure accountability. In this process, so to negotiate the price, the procuring authorities have to form a negotiation committee. Again, the negotiation committees, the members have to be qualified. They have to have technical expertise on the procurement subject matters. If the procurement is on health equipment, this person need to know about health equipment. Another layer of accountability and ensuring value for money is market research, as well as, I think, this lab called Value for Money Lab, especially for a high value procurement exercise. So any project that has, I think, if I'm not mistaken, 50 to 100 million has to go Value for Money Lab, in which then this process will ensure that the government will have the best price with the best price, and a project will be sustainable. So this process, I think, is, and after this process, that they can start negotiations. And of course, there's another clause here that the maximum time for negotiation is only 2 weeks. So if it's more than this, I think it's defeat the purpose of direct negotiation in the first place. So this is, in our opinion, there are some adequate measures in the current direct negotiation rules to ensure accountability and value for money. However, if we compare direct negotiation with similar methods in international procurement law, for example, the competitive negotiations or single source procurement method in the ancestral model of procurement law, there are some weaknesses. And here are the weaknesses that we can identify. The first one, the urgency conditions is too broad compared to ancestral. I think in ancestral, single source procurement, which is actually equivalent to our direct negotiations, is only applicable in catastrophic events, say COVID-19 crisis like what we have now. So something like this, you can do direct negotiation. Otherwise, you have, if it's urgency, something else, non-catastrophic, they have to use competitive negotiation. The second weakness that we see is lack of transparency. I think in ancestral, for example, competitive, before procuring authorities carry out any non-competitive method, such as the single source procurement, they have to publish notice, and also they have to publish the result after the exercise is carried out. So in our case, there's no requirement at all for these disclosures. Of course, the government has made an effort to improve transparency in government procurement. We have now, it's been for several years, we have My Procurement website that disclose notices of tenders, the result of the tenders. However, for the case of direct negotiations, it seems that the list is not very up to date. Let me show you that. I think if you go to My Procurement this morning, I checked it this morning, this is what we get. So this is the award for direct negotiations. The latest is only until 2017. Even I think the 101 directly negotiated contract that was disclosed this August is not here yet. So, and the last weakness that we see in the current rules is the measures of accountability do not cover explicitly the Ministry of Finance. The reason we say this is I think it's good that the circulars require procuring authorities to form assessment committees. But in several cases that we see in the Auditor General report, their recommendations are not being taken by the MOF. I believe MOF has their own reasons to not take these recommendations, but I think it would be good if they can justify in writing the reasons for this refusal to accept the recommendation from either from the assessment committee or from the negotiation committee at the procuring agencies level. So these, I think, that the weaknesses that we see, and I think these weaknesses then have a quite negative impact on the implementation later, and I will discuss that now. So let's see how these rules are being implemented. So as Lauren mentioned earlier, to understand the implementation, we look into Auditor's General Report from 2014 to 2018. Auditor General Report, I think, have quite significant number of cases, but from this number of cases, we identify 93 projects are carried out through direct negotiations. This 93 project has 392 contracts. So for each project, there's several contracts, and we in our calculations, there's about like 390 contracts. The total value of this 93 project is about 22 billion. However, the 93 projects identified in the AG reports, not all of them have the same level of details. So out of this 93, we only have about we have 76 projects that are discuss quite details in the AG reports. Interestingly, I think if we look into the justifications of the direct negotiations at the beginning, so actually most of it related to goods and services procurement. But the data that we have so far show that 60% of the projects actually works project. So as such, then we also look into the justifications, and in our opinion, only 18 out of 76 cases actually fully justified. And when reading all these reports, we also noticed that most of the projects suffer from either delay in completions, and some of them actually below required specifications. And even I think 1 or 2 of them are considered a sick project, project sakit. And only 20 of them, I think the AG said it's satisfactory project. So these are like the broad pictures of the cases that we look into. Now we want to see how the approval process, the contractor qualification process, and also price negotiation process are being carried out, whether they follow the steps that are being laid out in the circulars. So in the approval process, when we look into the 76 cases, there's no clear and consistent process. I think for now we identified 3 variations. So ideally, I think based on the circulars, so the application should come from controlling officers, which I believe it's a KSU. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but it's based on the Financial Procedures Act. The controlling officers is actually the KSU of the ministry or the head of the agency. So the rules is the applications should be submitted by the controlling officers to the Ministry of Finance. What we see in our cases, sometimes this request comes from the minister to the MOF or from the minister to the cabinet. I think one of the example that we can cite here is this project to install a road charge collection system and foreign vehicle entry permit system in Johor. So this project is requested by the Minister of Transport to Jamaah Menteri based on justification that this is urgent. This is urgently needed and need to be expedited. The minister also submitted the name of the company. However, upon assessment from the ministry itself, from the procuring entity, not the minister. So the team that assessed the company says that the company actually is not qualified to do the job. However, at the contract is still awarded to this company. So that's one of the variations. I think this case actually highlight our recommendation letter that the need for clarifications of roles between politicians and bureaucrats in procurement exercise. It seemed that when we read AG report, this line is quite blurred. The decision making on who which company should be appointed to deliver the contract seems to rest on the politician most of the time. Okay, the second variations, I'm going to try to move a little bit faster. The second variations of the approval process is direct appointment by Ministry of Finance. I think ideally, based on the circulars, the request comes from the procuring entity, say from the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Works, then Ministry of Finance will approve. But in some cases, the Ministry of Finance actually make the decision to appoint. I think this one case in Bera Hospital where the second package of the constructions actually is given out by the Ministry of Finance. And also this project is called e-Cadastre project. I think this is the project to make the register of ownership land ownership and also values and any data related to land ownership available electronically. So initially, I think the Jabatan Tanah dan Jabatan Tanah Jupem proposed to have open tender for this project. However, towards the end of the project, the Ministry of Finance decided that this project should be carried out through direct negotiation. So again, this is, I think, another gray area whether the Minister of Finance should be given that much discretion in deciding the nature or the method of procurement. The final another variations of approval process is, of course, this is not variation, basically a violations of the circulars is procurement or direct negotiation procurement without approval of the MOF. I think we found quite many cases. I mean, some of them I think it's done because of they want to expedite the process. I think like this case that was discussed in the AG reports, the procurement of lab equipment for crops for the future research center. So this one I think is very clear. It may be that actually it's actually justified that lab equipment can only be supplied by one or single or limited number of companies. But however, probably they want to expedite the process and they didn't submit application to the MOF. So these are the process, some of the variations from the current rules. I think let me discuss about the contractor qualification. So ideally, of course, all the appointed companies for direct negotiations have to have both technical, financial, and also administrative qualification based on what's written in the rules. For example, they have, if it's for works contract, they have to be registered with CIDB. They have, if for services, they have to register with the MOF, and they have to have certain codes for supplying to the government. But in many cases, in 17 cases at least, but this is the one that clearly, the cases that Auditor General clearly said that these companies are not competent. But I think if we look into the number of delays and incompletions, the number could be higher. The number of actually unqualified companies could be higher. So out of the 17 companies, 14 of them have poor records. So they in the past, when they do government project, they did it either they're incomplete, they delay the delivery of the project, but they still get the contract for direct negotiations. And the three of them actually do not feel they don't fulfill the preliminary requirements. Means that they actually not registered as government contractors. So this project to build housing for FELDA in northern states, I think, the companies actually are not registered to CIDB when they are appointed to be direct negotiation, to deliver the direct negotiation contract. And the one that mentioned here, Sekolah Sukan Perlis, I think it's quite interesting case. The Sekolah Sukan Perlis contractors was actually they didn't deliver. So this project, the Sekolah Sukan Perlis, was supposed to be delivered in 18 months. And this company awarded the contract through limited tender. However, after 18 months and even after, I think, 21 months, they couldn't deliver the project. And even at the end of the almost 2 years project period, only 49% of the project are being delivered. So this project is considered Project Sakit. Ideally, if it's Project Sakit, the government has to call for open tender to rescue the project. But in this Sekolah Sukan Perlis case, the MOF decided to reappoint the same contractor that couldn't deliver the project to rescue his failed project. So it's failed project. So I think this is one of the things that the rules probably are not quite adequate to address some of this problem. So the least, but the last process that we look into is the process, the price negotiation process. So here, as I mentioned earlier, so the procuring authorities, they have to form a price negotiation committee. But in some cases, actually the price negotiation committee is not formed at all. So the companies just send the quote, and the procuring entity submitted to an EPU or to MOF and approved. So in this way, it's not sure whether value for money is achieved this way, right? Another process that actually skip is market research. This is, I think, the case of, we have the case from emergency medical rescue services. These two, I think the procuring authority did not do market research, and as such, the price for the equipment for these services are quite higher than the market price. And as mentioned earlier, the road charges and the vehicle permit also skip value management exercise. And then this is quite a big project. And in some cases, actually, the market research and value market research is skipped because they receive exemption from the MOF. And again, the circulars does not have rules on how exemptions of this important step. So the rules on the exemptions of steps in the direct and direct negotiation rules. The last one is time restriction. So as I said earlier, so the price negotiation actually should be happening within 2 weeks, and then submitted to the MOF for final approval. But in this case, like the UniKL campus, this MIAT campus in Subang, the negotiation process actually takes about 229 days. So it's a lot longer than it's supposed to be. So based on these practices and also the rules that I discussed earlier, we have this recommendation. The first one, I think the first thing to do is actually, this is almost like immediate one, is to revise the current circulars, especially to again include clauses to improve accountability on the part of the MOF. I think the MOF should be required to provide written explanations if they reject the recommendation from the price negotiation committee or from the assessment committee, or if they appoint contractors that are different from that is proposed by the procuring entity. And then there's a need for the MOF also to do due diligence, whether these companies, I think this is very clear in the case of the RC, the road charges system. They have to ensure that these companies actually qualified. Another one, I think this is not included in the circulars, is automatic rejection for blacklisted companies and for companies that have direct interest to either procuring officers or to politician involved, or the minister of the minister, politician in the ministry. The third recommendations is, I think the third and fourth recommendations, I think something that can be taken into procurement legislation. The first one, we propose to include competitive negotiation. Competitive negotiations is basically a slightly more competitive direct negotiation, in which instead of negotiating with one company, procuring authorities should negotiate with at least 2 or 3 companies. So they can, you want to make sure in short time to get the best offer. I think, of course, ideally you do open tender, but in some difficult situations, say like in COVID-19, in these current situations, I think the need for expedited service is there, but we can do it by inviting bids from more than one company. And this can be done through the method called competitive negotiation. I think Malaysia has tender terhad system, but I'm not very sure that this method has transparency requirements in it. Or maybe we can modify the tender terhad to have transparency and more transparency or accountability measures in it. Another thing that we think is very important to include in the procurement legislation and will help direct negotiation achieve the value for money is to have the review system. The review system is a system in which procuring authorities' decision subject to review either by court or tribunal. So if contractors are not happy with the decision or we're not happy with the process, they can file complaints to court or tribunal established under the system. And a review of the entire process can be done, and the contract can be halted and even cancelled in this system. The last but not least, I think this is the last one, as I mentioned earlier, I think we need to clarify the role of ministers in the procurement process. This is something that cannot be done in procurement legislations, but I think can be done through other means. But this is something that seems to be more critical to do. The last but not least is we propose to have accountability platform for controlling officers. I think there is some platform now since 2016, if I'm not mistaken. We have sort of a public forum for KSU to sit and bring questions on the Auditor General report. So this is one platform that I think should continue in the future. And another thing is to call the KSU to say, for example, to public account committee to understand, and also not of course to put them in trouble, but also to understand more what are the difficulties or what are the challenges in delivering procurement in accountable, transparent, and clean way. So I think I close my presentation for now, Lawrence, and I hope that's not too long. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Uni. I won't penalize you for not sticking to your time restrictions.
Oh.
Okay. No, thank you very much. I mean, I think that sets up our conversation very well. So on this note, I'll now introduce our panelists. What I will do, just to save me providing one long spiel at the outset, is I'll just introduce each panelist in turn and invite them to give their initial response to the issues in Uni's presentation. I've asked each panelist to try to keep their remarks to under 10 minutes, so that we can move into the Q&A. If anyone in the audience has any questions they'd like to share, please feel free to start sharing them on the Q&A, and I can start to prepare for the question and answer session. Okay, the first of our panelists I would like to call upon is YB Dr. Ong Kam Ming. So Dr. Ong Kam Ming is the Member of Parliament for Bangi and Assistant National Director for Political Education for the Democratic Action Party. He was formerly the Deputy Minister of International Trade and Industry from July 2018 to February 2020. He was also a former Fulbright Scholar and holds a PhD in Political Science from Duke University. I think, as Uni has indicated, one of the challenges here is the division of responsibilities between the ministers and the civil servants. So it'll be very interesting to hear the ministerial perspective from YB. So over to you, YB Kam Ming.
Let me just, okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks a lot to Lawrence and also to Ideas for inviting me. Congratulations to Uni for your hard work in this area. I know you spent a lot of time on this in the past and continue to do so. So I really applaud your efforts and also Ideas' interest in this particular area. I'm just going to start off by zooming onto the point that Uni made about the overwhelming power of the Ministry of Finance, and also the fact that there's all these regulations set up for other ministries to apply to MOF for exemptions from competitive tenders or even limited tenders to go straight to direct nego. But MOF itself is, sort of seemingly exempt from this, and sometimes it can even, override decisions, made by made by others, other ministries. And this point goes to why it's really important to separate the role of the Minister of Finance and Prime Minister, which is what Pakatan Harapan did when we were in power in 2018. And the reason is because the Prime Minister already has a lot of power. If you add on the ability to make a lot of these kinds of financial decisions without any proper checks and balances, it would make the situation far more worse. Especially in the previous case of the Prime Minister and Finance Minister under the BN government, definitely there was much more room for these kinds of abuses to take place. That being said, I do agree with Uni to say that the SOPs and the current guidelines are there. Obviously, they can be improved, but it is not that easy for direct negotiations to be the norm. In fact, if you look at the figures that were shown by Uni and based on my own experience as well in government, most of the time, the competitive tenders or limited tenders are still the way of doing things. Civil servants don't want to go through the additional hurdles of having to justify why they want to do direct negotiations. And which is why I think when these direct negotiations are awarded, we need to pay much more careful attention to them, especially for projects above a certain amount. So there are existing checks and balances already, but much more needs to be done in order to enhance them. I also want to bring out the point that Uni made about the process by which the stakeholder or the the authority at the ministerial level is placed is not at the hands of the minister. I just want to clarify that. It is actually at the hand of the KSU. In fact, most of the time, whether it's competitive tenders or direct negos, the minister rarely gets involved. It is usually a civil servant decision, not just the KSU, of course, but there are different committees, subcommittees that have to go through the process of open tenders, limited tenders, as well as direct negos, even for direct negos. And perhaps what Uni can do to bolster this presentation is to state the thresholds, because there are threshold limits for direct nego for each level of authority. And the higher the amount, the higher up it has to go. And I think the threshold for the KSU is, I can't remember the exact amount, but that is the authority that he's allowed to approve. Anything more than that, he will have to go to MOF to seek additional permission. In MOF, again, is the KSP. Tan Sri would know about this. Perhaps the regulations may have changed since he retired. But the KSP is the one that will have to decide on direct nego up to a certain amount, and then above that, it will be in the hands of the Minister of Finance, right? So that's why, again, the role of the Minister of Finance is very important. And I've seen examples in the past where different people, whether it's contractors or other ministers, will go and lobby the Minister of Finance directly, to get certain things done. This was based on my 2 months at the Ministry of Finance as special assistant to a special officer to the then Minister of Finance, Lim Guan Eng. So I saw previous documents and whereby these kinds of direct nego contracts were awarded to certain companies. I won't reveal. I can't remember the direct details, exact details, but definitely I spotted these kinds of documents. So that's why I think the MOF actually plays a very important role in managing the entire process, and it's a pretty complicated process, as what Uni has pointed out too, involving different levels, and it would be really good if you could get a civil servant who is probably closer to the action to sort of like describe it in more detail, but I'm not sure whether they'll be allowed to or not. Maybe someone who's recently retired. Okay. In addition to what Uni has done, I think it's also important to highlight that there are different areas of quote-unquote direct nego that we also have to pay attention to that are not in the Auditor General's report, and perhaps not under what Uni talked about just now, which is, for example, projects, public-private partnership projects that are approved by a unit called UKAS, Unit Kerja Sama Awam Swasta. It's basically the unit that's in charge of public-private partnerships. We, under Pakatan Harapan, we moved it from the Prime Minister's office, Prime Minister's department, to Ministry of Finance, because ultimately whatever decisions that are made by the PPP unit will have the cost will have to be borne by the Ministry of Finance, right? And in the past, we've seen a lot of these kinds of PPP projects negotiated in ways which were not transparent and also had very significant financial impact on the government. This would include some of the commitments and contingent liabilities that are not part of the budget deficit as well as the official budget figures. So this is one area I think that needs probably a separate investigation. And then also, just to point out that there are also agencies within ministries that have their own different kind of procurement criteria. So it is actually possible for ministries to sometimes bypass direct nego considerations by allocating sums of money and projects to agencies. And this is, you don't have to go through the same kind of direct nego approvals. If you're going to say, look, this particular agency is going to take care of this particular project, and I'm going to award this money to that particular agency. So the ministry actually passes out the responsibility to the agency, and then the agency, may have a different level of scrutiny that is, maybe further away from the Auditor General and also internal audit procedures, or different internal audit procedures. So that's something that we need to be aware of as well. So the last point I want to make is that there are checks and balances. The AG report is definitely one of them, but it is not something that is guaranteed that the AG will go through the direct nego projects on a yearly basis to scrutinize them. So I think this may be something that we want to bring up in Parliament at the committee level for the appropriate committee. And then also there are internal audit units within each ministry. This is chaired by the KSU. Again, this one is really subject to the KSU's desire of wanting to make these internal audits more transparent. As a deputy minister, I don't get involved in these kinds of internal audit situations, but I was invited by a retired the internal auditor of MITI, who was going to retire soon, to chair a special meeting because of certain issues that were brought up by her, and she was afraid that the KSU would not attend to those issues, and I decided to chair that special meeting, so I have some experience in terms of the internal audit process. But again, these kinds of things will only see the light of day if they go up to the AG level, Auditor General level, and they are published. So that's why it's really important to have this kind of scrutiny by people like Uni, as well as having scrutiny of the Attorney General, Auditor General's report at the Parliamentary Accounts Committee level, which is now chaired by an opposition MP. Again, a reform that was brought in by Pakatan Harapan. My 10 minutes are up. I'll stop there, and then happy to take questions later on. Thanks.
Thank you very much, YB. I think you've set out the next couple of papers we can work on, including the procurement role of agencies and PPPs as well. So thank you very much for that. Okay, next I would like to introduce Tan Sri Sheriff Kasim, who served as the Director General of the Economic Planning Unit at MOF before serving as the Secretary General of the Treasury. He then went on to become the Managing Director of Khazanah, and he is the founding member of the G25 and has been active in voicing opinions on different policy challenges in Malaysia. So I think as indicated by YB, it would be very interesting to hear from Tan Sri Sheriff, given the centrality of the Ministry of Finance in the procurement system and the concern that's been raised that whether the Ministry of Finance has too much power in that context. So Tan Sri Sheriff, would be very grateful to hear your remarks, please. Okay, we just need to take you off mute, Tan Sri.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Today, you can hear me?
Yes.
Hello, thank you very much, Lawrence. And thank you to Ideas for inviting me to be on the panel. And first of all, I'd like to say that I enjoyed very much listening to Sri Muniati's presentation. A lot of it is new to me too. As you may know, I retired from the civil service 26 years ago. So I think YB Ong has a better knowledge about how the government runs these days. But I just like to touch briefly on the background so that we can understand all this from the historical perspective. Back in the 70s, 80s, there were, all government procurement was carried out through the standard procedure as laid out in the financial general orders and explained in the treasury circulars. That is by open tender. Of course, exceptions were made in some cases where the value is small. For example, education or school wanting to procure to buy pencils and pen. They are allowed to do it by direct quotation, by direct negotiation. But above a certain amount, they have to be open to tender, and above, and the higher you go, when we go to the big contract, they have to be open. They have to be open tender. Then in early 80s, when Tun Mahathir became PM, I was there in the treasury. Our Minister of Finance was to present. He came to the office one day and announced to us that the cabinet has decided that direct negotiations will be allowed in certain cases. Now, that took us in the treasury by surprise because, as we grew up with a system of tender, with a system of, in fact, in the Ministry of Finance, there were two committees. One with contracts below a certain amount. The higher committee, this was contract above a certain amount. And that has been the system. So when we were told that the cabinet had agreed to make exceptions, we were taken by surprise. And but then in the 80s, early 90s, there was not much of direct negotiation projects. It's really later as the public expectations the public expected the government to do more, build more schools, build more hospitals faster. Then came the idea that we should tap into the resources of the private sector. So they began to introduce the concept of PPP, which I noticed Sri Muniati didn't touch this very much. I assume that in your presentation, you're talking about direct negos on projects funded by the government. If they are funded by the government, they are in the budget, right? Pre-approved the 5-year plan because budget only a 5-year period. That should be the system, but of course, over time, we also had these what we call helicopter projects. Suddenly, these are projects which come down from the sky. They're not in the list of approved projects, but the ministries are told, these are to be implemented. Of course, that's how we get all these supplementary budget, going to Parliament. But because of this new project, which are totally unexpected, not planned for, so the Ministry of Finance has no choice because it's a decision of the cabinet. The Ministry of Finance has no choice but to approve the project and later apply for supplementary approval in Parliament. So I agree that direct negotiations can lead to abuses. Of course, we cannot also at the same time, because of that, we cannot at the same time ban direct negotiation, because there are certain cases where, due to the urgency of the situation, or in the case of military procurement, secrecy need to be banned. You're talking about government coming out with a new legislation, right? What do you call that? Public Procurement, Government Procurement Act. You said that the government has agreed to introduce this act. I don't know when, but they have given the word to it. Even in the act, they will ban direct negotiations are necessary, unavoidable. But as a general rule, I agree that procurement should be by tender. Could be open tender, could be restricted tender. But on the point whether ministers should be involved, I don't think so, because I don't think they should be involved, because if you look at the KSU of each ministry is the controlling authority over the budget. It's not the minister. So that is why when the audit committee wants to pull up a ministry because of the report by the Auditor General that the money was not spent properly, he will call the KSU. Committee will hold the KSU responsible, because if the KSU is responsible, then I think it is not fair for ministers to interfere, because if anything goes wrong, and so I think it's best that for accountability, there should be no political intervention. But I also think that given the current mood in the country, where the people are very much more vocal, much more concerned because of all the things that happened in the last few years, 1MDB, Felda, Tabung Haji, and everything. Maybe it's also time that we should get parliamentary select committee involved, but involved in getting the responsible ministries to appear before the committee to answer questions on projects which have attracted public attention or which have become matters of public interest. I think parliamentary committees will be useful in the sense that it gives transparency, it gives satisfaction to the people, that their views are being heard, that their representatives are playing their role in parliament. So maybe the time has come for one of the parliamentary, I think the government has approved, the new government has approved 6 parliamentary committees. I heard maybe they should be assigned with duties of oversight. Government procurement, whether they are any kind of government, there are issues, if there are controversies, whether it's low or whether it is old, I think the parliamentary committee should get involved.
Thank you.
Maybe I should stop there for a while.
Yes, thank you very much, Tansri. We had a bit of interference on the line. I think we managed to get most of what you were saying. I think, yeah, the historical context is very important. And I think I definitely want to come back to this question on the role of Parliament and the parliamentary capacity to provide that oversight mechanism to over the public procurement system. So I'd like to come back to YB on that just before, because he has to leave us in about 30 minutes. But first, I'm pleased to introduce our third panelist, who is Alan Kurupakaran. I hope I got that right, Alan, apologies, who is a partner at Oaks Consultancy. So Alan has over 30 years of diverse experience in private, public, and civil society sectors in the area of governance, integrity, and anti-corruption. He oversaw the setting up of the governance and integrity committees across all government ministries and high-risk agencies, both at the federal and state level. Prior to that, Alan was the executive director of Transparency International Malaysia, which is the local chapter of Transparency International, which is the global coalition leading the fight against corruption. So I think Alan has a perspective both from sort of outside, but also inside the government, trying to address some of these challenges. So Alan, over to you.
Thank you, Lawrence. And again, just like to express my gratitude to Ideas for inviting me to be a panel. I'll try and keep it very short. I'm aware of the time limits that we have. I'll answer the question which is posed for this webinar: direct negotiation, should we abandon the practice? So before I do that, very quickly, if I could, I just want to highlight 4 questions related to this topic. Number one is, why was direct negotiation introduced? And Uni has very clearly stated the 5 criteria that are used for it. And I believe that these criteria are very, very clear. The intent is very clear. The aim is to address practical gaps that exist in the normal procurement process, right? So the criteria as outlined in the Government Garis Panduan for Permohonan Perolehan secara rundingan terus is clear. And I think one important point to note is that these Garis Panduans, or these processes, was updated. The latest was on the 15th of July 2019, which indicates that this is an ongoing process. Whatever guidelines that are issued by the government are continuously updated and upgraded, which is a very important point to take note, because it's not just a static document, but it's something that evolves with the challenges that we face over time. The second point I wanted to ask, question that I wanted to ask is, how is direct negotiations implemented? And I think some of the key points to take note is that at every point in time, any project that comes under the ambit of direct negotiation must be justified. Justifications must exist. I believe another point that is related to direct negotiation is that it should not be something that is encouraged. So direct negotiations should only take place when it falls within those ambits or those 5 criteria, and it should not be something that is seen as a standard process for negotiations. Having said that, the government has very clear guidelines and processes in place, the PK 715 and 716, which Uni has referred to very clearly in the document paper. And going back to what YB Ong had mentioned earlier, I think the ownership, oversight, approval of the direct negotiation process falls very, very clearly within the ambit of the Ministry of Finance. and specifically the controlling officer, pegawai pengawal. So in essence, the buck falls with MOF. The success, the perceived shortcomings, failures of direct negotiations fall within the ambit of the MOF. And any improvements, any suggestions, output that comes out of this discussion, today's webinar, should be addressed and should be addressed by the Ministry of Finance itself. Yeah. In that sense, it's very good because we know who the source is with regards to improving the whole process. Yeah. Whilst direct negotiations involve other ministries and agencies, decisions and processes are controlled by the Ministry of Finance, which I think is a very good way of streamlining how the process is and engaging with the owner of this process itself. So that's important. My third question related to the topic today is direct negotiations subject to abuse? Now, the short answer to that is yes, if the process is compromised. Now, we have, if I may, I'd like to refer to the list that was released in Parliament in August this year by the Minister of Finance, where a total of 101 direct negotiation projects valued at 6.61 billion ringgit was released. And if we refer to that list, we can see a wide range of projects ranging from a couple of 100,000 to more than 4 billion ringgit, which were listed in there. Now, I'm not questioning any of them in terms of the values of the contracts. What I wanted to highlight very, very quickly is that there were projects that were listed, for example, project number 4, which is upgrading of the infrastructure for the electric rail, 4 billion ringgit. Now, this project, my guess is that it would have fallen within the ambit of a government-to-government project because of the value of it. Again, the question here is that there's to be asked is, under which criteria within the 5 does it fall under? Okay, because again, it goes back to the justification of it. So moving on along these 101 projects, we see certain other projects, waste operator, we see a project for the measurement of air quality, 4 million ringgit, a project to manage data centers, event planning, and also surveys to be conducted. These fell within direct negotiations. And my question is, are these projects really meeting the criteria, the 5 criteria that are listed? They would seem to be projects which can be undertaken by companies, more than one companies, not necessarily single source, with the knowledge and expertise to do that. So again, the questions that should be asked is, why were they direct negotiations? And what was the justification for it? So I think those are pertinent, critical questions that needs to be asked when we look at direct negotiation contracts. Moving on, what are the risks of how many of these sick or questionable projects were direct negotiations, and how many were flagged in the Auditor General's report? Now, again, we need to be very clear that the Auditor General's report takes a cross-section of procurement or projects within the government service. They are not wide-ranging because of obviously limitations with regards to resources within the Auditor General office. UNI's and IDEA's report states that between 2014 to 2018, there were 93 direct nego projects listed in the 8 auditors report. Okay, we can, and the report does a very good job of breaking down and analyzing these. So I will leave it to the report to be self-explanatory in that sense. But what I want to highlight is, what are the risks of direct negotiations? Firstly, when the processes are not followed. Obviously, when the processes are not followed, you are going to have risks. And what are these risks? These risks are that they are awarded to a contractor who may not have the capabilities to undertake the project. who subsequently may subcontract it to the more capable contractors. Yeah. So that would then lead to the question of, is the government getting value for money? Is the contract amount matching what the service is being provided? Or is the government paying above what is required? Now, the biggest risk in all this is that obviously the government may be forced, if the project has got challenges, to step in and give additional resources or funding to complete the project. So these are obvious risks that stem out of giving direct negotiations to firms who may not be qualified, or contractors who may not be qualified to undertake them. So those were some of the questions that I wanted to highlight before answering the question. Do direct negotiations, are they practices that should be abandoned? My short answer is no, they should not be abandoned, because direct negotiations have its value, as I mentioned earlier. They address practical gaps in the normal procurement process. However, there are potentially tools that can be subject to misuse and abuse. And these are highlighted in IDEA's report very, very clearly. As such, I believe that there needs to be constantly vigilant oversight on how these rules are applied. And that's very, very important. And to do that, I believe certain initiatives can be taken to reduce the risk of this risk happening. If I can just, Lawrence, very quickly, I just want to highlight a couple of these initiatives. One is that I believe the numbers of direct negotiation contracts should be reduced. Your paper highlights that in 2018, 8.2% of total procurement was direct negotiations. So that is 1 out of 12 projects, which I believe is very, very high. Yeah. We should look at those criteria that are in place and ensure that they strictly meet their criteria. And I believe Uni had highlighted this as one of those red flags in terms of projects that came under the ambit of direct negotiation. Secondly, I think we should set a higher threshold for projects to qualify for direct negotiations. Over time, more and more companies can offer solutions and do the work that maybe 10 or 15 years ago was single source. So we should raise that threshold for letting more companies, making sure that more companies can be competitive in offering those solutions. Thirdly, we should ensure that the projects that fall within the ambit of direct negotiations, other than the G2G projects, are small in nature in terms of the value, so that they can be easily monitored and they reduce the risk of they reduce audit risk. If we look at the auditor's report between 2014 and 18, the largest direct nego project was the Pago Higher Education Hub, which is 4 billion ringgit. Now that begs the question, how did it fall under direct negotiation and under which criteria? Something so huge, which would take a long time to implement, must have been planned under the RMK plan, under the annual budget. So why did it fall under that? So these are questions that need to be asked. One other important criteria is that direct negos, 60% of those projects that were in the auditor's report between 2014 and 18 were for works-based projects, infrastructure-based projects, hospitals, project perumahan rakyat, police academies. Again, it begs the question, these must be planned. These infrastructure projects should have been planned. And with planning, you obviously know with works-based projects, the requirement for direct negotiation, unless it is it falls within the ambit of immediate or an emergency, it could be done by so many contractors. So competitive bidding should have been in place. So again, we should go back to those 5 criteria, which I believe are there for a purpose, and making sure that they fall within the ambit of those 5 criteria. One quick point with regards to unqualified contractors, Uni had mentioned this in the report. 17 out of the 76 contracts which were evaluated by Uni in the contract, with values of contracts at 3 billion ringgit, were found, based on IDEA's benchmark, were found to be unqualified contractors. Again, why were unqualified contractors selected, and why were the processes of raising those red flags not brought up at that point in time? Because again, as I said earlier, when an unqualified contractor gets to do a job and if they are unable to meet the criteria, the government has to step in to meet the obligations. And this is where taxpayers' money is then being used unnecessarily, in my view as well. Okay. My last point, if I can very quickly say that, is I think we should make it standard for a list of beneficial ownerships to be applied for all direct nego contracts. This is to remove the potential risk of conflict of interest. So that list of beneficial ownership should be out there, and where there is decisions that are made overriding the decisions of the audit committee within the ministries or agencies, overriding the recommendations, if ever that happens, which is allowed, I believe that the standard should be that an auditor's general's office should make that a project that is audited once it's completed. Okay, because to identify why that happened. I will leave it at that right now, Lawrence, and I'll be happy to add more input as we go along. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan. Yeah, there's a lot of points there that I want to come back to. But at this point, I want to come back to YB just because he has to leave us at 11:30. So YB, I have a specific question for you that I think has come up a couple of times, and you mentioned it in your presentation as well. Sorry, in your remarks as well, which is about the need to strengthen the oversight from within Parliament. And I think that's something that really clearly came through when we did our roundtables, was that what transparency and accountability requires is a sort of ecosystem of different institutional checks and balances, and you can't rely on, say, administrative rules, and in order for those to be enforced, there needs to be that accountability. So what do you see as the sort of barriers to achieving that level of parliamentary oversight, both in terms of barriers in terms of where the ministries are not disclosing information, or where Parliament maybe lacks capacity? These aren't simple things to analyse, and in terms of parliamentary staff and the way the scrutiny committees are assembled. So it'd be very good to have your perspective as a parliamentarian about what it will take for Parliament to provide this scrutiny role on an ongoing basis.
Yeah. Thanks. I'll just make these remarks before I go. I'm not a member of the Parliamentary Accounts Committee, PAC. I've not been a member. DAP, my party DAP currently has 2 members, including the chairman, Member of Parliament for Ipoh Timur Wong Kawo, and the Member of Parliament for Kluang Wong Suu Kyi. One of the obstacles I think we need to get rid of with regards to PAC meetings is we need to firstly make them open to a wider number of people, including journalists. Right now, if I wanted to attend a PAC meeting as a member of parliament, I couldn't do it because it's closed. Only to the members of the PAC, the secretarial staff, and also whoever is being called for questioning. Ideally, it would be good if, let's say, the proceedings of the PAC are broadcast live. We've seen this. This is a standard practice in other democracies. We've seen how House and Senate committees in the US, make these open as well, so that when these CEOs or these public officials go up to get questioned, they can, be put in the hot seat. So I think that would be one obstacle that needs to be addressed. Another would be protection for PAC members, so that they can have some level of legal immunity. So I'm not sure whether you're aware, but after the publication of the road charges and vehicle entry permit report by the PAC, after the publication of a report by the PAC on the activities of the Yayasan Wilayah Persekutuan, or the Federal Territories Foundation, which incriminated them in certain actions, they threatened to sue the chairman of the PAC. And they wanted to sue him on an individual basis, which I think is very improper, because the PAC is not just the chairman, but the other members of the PAC as well. So I think to threaten public officials in that way, is I think inappropriate. I'm not sure whether the PAC chairman is covered by existing law with regards to public officials in these litigation matters. But yeah, that's another area that needs to be looked into. Yeah, I'll stop there for now. For PAC, probably the last point would probably be resources. The meeting schedule for the PAC is actually very heavy. And if let's say they could be staffed with better resources in terms of capacity, I think that would be very helpful to the members and to my colleague who's the chairman. So thank you very much. I want to encourage Uni and the Ideas team to continue doing your hard work, and I'll be happy to contribute my 2 cents worth at subsequent forums. Thanks, Lawrence. I'll leave you guys now. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much, YB. Thank you for your time. Okay, so I want to continue just on this track, just for a minute around sort of the accountability and the institutional setup around accountability. So Alan, I'll come to you in a moment in terms of a question I think that's been put on the chat around how can we sort of embed particularly MACC representation into the direct negotiation process. But I want to just continue first on the role of Parliament and come back to you, Tan Sri Sheriff, to ask about something that you mentioned actually, which I'm quite interested in, which is the potential for the senior civil servants, particularly the KSUs, to actually attend the hearings directly of the PAC. So that's it from my own personal experience in the UK, where I worked on preparing the annual accounts for the Ministry of Defence. It would be our KSU equivalent that would have to be grilled on the details by the Public Accounts Committee directly, and I think that sort of changed the extent to which the KSU felt empowered and responsible to be directly controlling the finances and to resist, I think, any kind of political or ministerial interference, because he knows he's the one who's going to have to answer to the PAC in a broadcast hearing. So Tan Sri, can I ask you, what do you think, from your perspective historically and in that position, we can do to both empower the senior civil servants and but also ensure that accountability rests with them? Be very grateful for your reflections on that question, Tan Sri.
You are asking what else can we do to empower senior civil servants?
Yeah, and specifically your suggestion that they should attend the hearings of the PAC. I think we have some problems connecting with Tan Sri Sheriff. So,
voice camera. No. Hello.
Hello. Yes, Tan Sri, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes. Okay, I think we've got a bit of problem with the connection, Tan Sri. I think maybe it might improve if you turn off your video. We can prioritize the audio.
Hello.
Hi, Tan Sri.
Yeah. Hey.
Okay, I think we better just move on I'm going to come back to Alan, if I may. I want to pick up the question that's been put on.
Hello.
Hi, Tan Sri, are you back?
I'm back, but the voice is breaking up sometimes, huh?
Yeah, I think the
connection. So,
okay, please.
Asking me whether what else can we do to empower civil servants?
Yeah.
Oh. Action.
Okay, Tan Sri, we'll give you a minute to try and work.
Yeah. Yeah. Can you hear me now?
Yes, but the connection is quite bad, Tan Sri. So I think.
I don't know whether it's his side or our side.
Okay. Sorry about that. The transition to the Zoom format is is still a work in progress. So Alan, I just want to pick up the question that's been raised in the chat, and this is something that actually we talked about in one of our roundtables, which is, how can we build on some of these existing mechanisms within the ministries themselves? And I think you have some direct experience of that. So specifically, the suggestion is from John Lee Hoare, which is to include independent representatives from organizations like Transparency International and/or senior officers from MACC in the direct negotiation committees. Is that something that you think is a practical option, or something that we could pursue to sort of strengthen that accountability?
Short answer to that, Lawrence, is that I would not recommend that as a first option. Like I mentioned during my brief earlier, I think the processes in place are very, very clear, and they have empowered relevant people to do the job. So the question is, I believe the bigger question is, what happens when the process is compromised? Yeah, I don't necessarily believe that we need to open it up to external parties, whether they be from MACC or civil society, etc. Because I believe this is a responsibility that falls within the government itself, and specifically here, the Ministry of Finance. So I believe that they have been empowered to do their job, and they should be allowed to do that. The pertinent question is, what happens if there are compromises along the way? If there are red flags that are raised, what happens? How is this process then escalated? How is it addressed? Who addresses it? And do we then reduce that risk? So I think that is a more pertinent way, in my opinion, of addressing it. Whilst we're on this topic, I also mentioned during some of the roundtables that I participated in that there are existing mechanisms already in place within the government itself. So I had talked about the role of the chief integrity officers, who are in all ministries and high-risk agencies. Now, when we formed these CIOs, the main task that was given to them was that they were meant to be preventive in nature. So they were meant to identify this risk. So I think one area that we could perhaps pursue on would be ensuring that the CIOs were allowed to review the processes as they take place, and note and highlight deviations or risks that are identified, and be given the protection to be able to then raise this out. I think if that process was allowed to take place without any risks to the functions of the CIOs, I believe that would address your query as you had given it to me.
Yeah, I'm back. Are you hearing me?
Yep, we can hear you.
I agree with what Alan said. I think if you look at the guidelines which Sri Muniati presented, and also if you read the website of UCAS, UCAS is a unit in the Prime Minister's Department, and as Mr. Ong, Wabi Ong said, it was later transferred to Ministry of Finance. UCAS implements the PPP projects. But they also have similar guidelines like what Sri Muniati showed us, in the Ministry of Finance. So Ministry of Finance takes care of direct negos on projects funded through the government budget. UCAS takes care of the PPP projects which are funded by the private sector, and the private sector has got an agreement with the government on the costing and how to pay back the private sector, the commercial agreement. So the guidelines indicate that they have already laid down the steps and procedures to avoid any issues, controversies. But the question is that, as we know, in many cases, the procedures are not followed. In my WhatsApp message this morning, I pointed out, for example, the PPP project, which was awarded on the rail track, I think something on rail track, the project number 1 in the list of 101 projects released by, in August by the Minister of Finance. 4.6 or 4.3 billion, it was awarded to LTAT. Now the question is, why to LTAT? I'm quite sure, I'm 100% sure, LTAT knows nothing about rail. So my suspicion is that, somebody in the private sector must have approached LTAT. Look, I have got this beautiful project, we can propose this to government. And what happens, LTAT say, okay, we'll be your partner. The role of LTAT is just to lobby for the project at the highest levels of government so that, there is greater certainty that it will be approved. So all the LTAT would do, I think, is just collect a commission fee. They become the silent partner. The private sector does all the job, all the work. And of course, all this adds to the cost of the project when there are several layers of. So how do we prevent such things? I would think that the Ministry of Finance would have automatically cancel that arrangement and say why can't the private sector proposal come direct to the government? Why must you ally yourself? Why must you find an ally in LTAT or MARA or FELDA? They know nothing about this project. I mean, that's not their line. But the private sector wants to make sure that what he has proposed will get through. And so he needs a strong agency with the right connections at the top. I mean, that's how it doesn't, you don't need a PhD to say that, and all that will result in inflated costs. So these are the things that I think we have to be careful about. And that's where I think parliamentary committees can play a role, because civil servants, civil servants are not that powerful. Of course, they are the controlling authority, but the politicians are the higher, they have more power. So who can question them except the parliamentary committee? Now, I think Ong Kiaming referred to the practice, like in the US Senate. If you watch the US Senate, I'm sure it's the same in British Parliament. Let's say the budget will allocate 1 billion for, let's say, a rail project. And then the ministry feels that because of some urgent problem, they want to transfer 200 million of that allocation to a bus transport project. If it is in the US, that will have to go to the Senate. The Senate committee will query, why do you need to transfer 200 million out of 1 billion meant for the railway project to, let's say, land transport or bus transport? That kind of accountability, I think, is not practiced in Malaysia, sorry to say. And you give it you give the power to the Minister of Finance and the Prime Minister. That is not right, because they are also they have got the political connections too. So you don't know whether the decision they're making is politically motivated or not. And the public is right, to question, to be skeptical and to be questioned. So that's why I think, as YB Ong said, it should go to the parliamentary committee, and it should be open to the public. The press should be there, the media should be there. And after each meeting, as the members of the committee leave the committee room, the media should ask them questions. We heard you say this and that. Why did you say this, or why did you agree to that? So then the public will see it on TV and they will say, they'll feel satisfied, that the issues are being addressed. And I think that's the main thing. Everybody makes mistakes in this world. Nobody is perfect. Everybody makes mistakes, but as long as it is explained properly, the public, generally our public also is quite mature now. They can accept if the explanation is good.
Yeah.
Lawrence, if I may, while we're talking about the PAC, I agree with what Tan Sri and YB Ong had suggested, but I think another thing to also touch on is that what happens after the PAC issues a report. Now, just a few days ago, they issued a report on the foreign workers recruitment system, and they highlighted many, many red flags in it, right? So I think the pertinent question that also needs to be addressed is, what happens after this? Is it mandated that the enforcement agencies, the regulators, then step in to do their investigations? And what happens with those investigations? Because I believe the PAC plays a very important role in highlighting cases or issues which have a direct impact on the rakyat. So it's pertinent upon the powers that be to make sure that the PAC report with its recommendations are then looked at in further detail with regards to making sure that action is taken if necessary. It can't be that it stops once the PAC report is issued. So going through the process of having live sessions, broadcasts, etc., is well and good. But I think the more important question is, once the report is issued, what action is taken? And that is very, very, very crucial.
No, thank you very much, Alan. I mean, I think, yes, I think a lot of the discussion has been on, okay, how do we strengthen that parliamentary oversight? But as you say, actually, there's good stuff coming out of the Parliamentary Accounts Committee as it is. Why is that not having the impact? And I think, I think something we've talked about before is sort of the extent to which those reports have teeth and have impact, but also the extent to which they get picked up in the media and by the general public. So I think it's also about ensuring there's a public platform for that scrutiny. And I actually want to pivot from that into a separate question, which I want to put to you, Alan, which has been raised in the chat, which is about the context when I introduced this session was that we are hoping and expecting that the government will come forward with public procurement legislation. Now, of course, most of the rules we've been discussing this morning, like the 5 criteria, all these things that govern direct negotiation, are administrative. They're administrative circulars. Do you think that legislation, and therefore opening the door to essentially these policies being played out in the courts potentially, or being enforceable through the courts, or justiciable in some ways, do you think that will improve the enforcement of these rules? Do you think we should see a legislation as a kind of a stronger way of doing that, or actually is there risk that it becomes less flexible and actually many of these issues will still need to be managed in a more administrative way? What's your perspective on that?
I believe public procurement legislation will always be welcome because it's legislation, and legislation needs to be followed. My personal opinion with regards to legislation, again, is it is long term. The process of coming up with drafts, having stakeholder engagement and passing it will take time. So I believe, and I think I mentioned this during roundtables, it should be a long-term objective of the government. There is absolutely nothing wrong in having legislation to manage public procurement. I think what is crucial, and I believe right now we are faced with challenges just by looking at the context of the report that is issued by IDEAS. There are so many areas which require immediate action. And these areas, these actions are something that we could do immediately. So for example, the question of not meeting the 5 criteria, the question of unqualified contractors, the question of, I believe the biggest question of all is the question of availability of information. I think IDEAS has done a very good job of shifting through the AG's Auditor General's report and the My Procurement portal. But you're working with information that is there, that is currently available. The bigger question is mandating that information is published. Information related to direct negotiations are published, including justifications, including beneficial ownership. This information, when it's in the public realm, helps with transparency. It helps to improve the process because it highlights potential risk areas as well. So I believe the bigger thing that is right on our plate right now is publishing relevant information, making it up to date, making sure that the My Procurement portal has got direct nego contracts as of now. It is technology. It is not rocket science. It is just putting information up there for the public to view. And as I mentioned during my talk earlier, all this comes under the ambit of the Ministry of Finance. They control it. So it is not difficult to have it done because once the information is there, as IDEAS has shown, it can be analyzed. You can then ask particular questions. And this is also for direct negos which come under the ambit of emergencies or segera. There is by all means, go ahead and do the direct negos, but make sure you publish the information and the justification for it, because that is when we improve our processes as we go along. So I think the short answer is yes, legislation is important for the long term, but whilst we work towards that, improve the current processes. And one of the best ways of doing it is putting information out for public viewing.
On that point, I just like to add that I think NGOs have suggested that we should have the Freedom of Information Act. I think that should come. That should also be introduced, so that when you have the Government Procurement Act, the media, will have the right to ask for information. I don't know what's happening to the Freedom of Information Act. Has the government committed itself to it? I'm not aware.
Lawrence, can I add a little bit on the procurement legislations? I think another thing that I highlight in my presentations is one of the point that I think can be included in the procurement legislation is what the international system called review system or challenge proceeding systems. I think a lot of loopholes now, especially in terms of contractor qualifications, actually can be addressed by this. And say, for example, if one company is not happy that his, counterparts are being awarded contracts, and he knows that this person is not qualified, so they can challenge this decision either in courts or in any tribunal system. I mean, this is the problem as well, right? If we want to have review system, what kind of court system do we want to have? That's another technical question that I think we all need to discuss as well. But the fact to have this kind of system in place will provide a sort of legal basis for everyone to question the decision happen. Because I think right now, one of the experts that come to our roundtable highlight this problem when certain companies, they want to challenge the decisions of procurement. They can't do that. They can't do this in courts because the courts does not have legal basis to open up this, to open the procurement process, because the procurement process is regulated by circulars. not by law. So I think to have legislations will actually improve the accountability mechanism in procurement process, including direct negotiation.
Yeah, no, thanks. I think that's a helpful point to kind of why it's important that some of these things need to be set out in legislation to just to provide that stronger role of enforcement.
And I think just one thing, I think there's a lot of discussions on PPP. If I may touch on that as well. I think we didn't discuss much on this, and I thank you for Tan Sri, who actually highlight that there is separate rules, separate circulars for PPP, which, well, it's not so much different, but yes, it's regulated by different circulars. That's why we didn't touch on it. But actually, some example now that I went through the cases, actually some example actually come from PPP. The Pago one that you mentioned, Alan, is actually PPP project. And PPP project, of course, in Malaysia has always been, in a way, directly negotiated because it's a solicited proposal, right? So a company is interested to do some project, they submit application to UCAS, and UCAS will look into it and see whether this thing that's something that we need as a country. So after evaluation, they go to different committees, then they will go to Jamaah Menteri, and Jamaah Menteri will look into it, whether it's, it's something that we need, then they will award. In other countries, solicited proposal, unsolicited, not solicited, unsolicited proposal like this, there are other methods that actually can, they can improve competition. I think right now, the PPP project seems to be uncompetitive because of the nature, but other countries introduce what they call a Swiss challenge. Even I think Myanmar actually used the Swiss challenge. So Swiss challenge, when government receive unsolicited proposals like this, what they can do is they call for bids from other companies. You cannot just accept it right away. Then you have comparison. So if the challenge proposals better, then you can offer the original, the one that proposed, whether they can match the challenge. If not, then they will be. I think I think in India, for example, they actually provide some sort of payment to whatever cost incurred for the original proposal to make, right? So there is a system to actually improve competition in current PPP project, but this is something that needs to be regulated in different, I think even in different legislations when it comes to concessions. Even in the UK, I think, if I'm not mistaken, actually concession like this, the PPP project, is regulated by different rules than traditional procurement. So if we are to have this procurement legislation, I think there's a broader discussions that whether we need separate legislation for PPP and separate legislation for traditional procurement.
Okay.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Uni, for addressing the point on PPP, because it's come up quite a lot. I mean, I'm going to have to wrap up soon, but Uni, I just wanted you to clarify one other thing, because both Alan and Tan Sri referred to it. So in terms of the disclosure of projects and how much data we had to go on, because we have the Auditor General reports, which is disclosed, and then we had, of course, that list that was published by Tengku Zafrul, and then you have what on the e-procurement website. Can you just very quickly, just in just a minute or two, just explain, how much we really know about how much direct negotiation is happening? So what is the coverage of what actually has been disclosed so far, and where are the gaps?
This is okay. Let me try to remember what's the research process.
Sorry.
But the list in the direct, in the AG reports, which is the 90 projects, I think only handful of them, I think less than 5 of them actually listed in my procurement. So if we add into, I think in my procurement around 114 cases. So if we can add into it, so then more than directly negotiated contract and more than 93. Then of course there's a new list of 101. That too, because that one happens in 2018, will not be covered by the research that we do, because the one that we do is actually project that happened probably close or happening already in 2018. Or even closed in 2017. So the 101, the 101 directly negotiated contract published in December is not covered in the AG reports that we look into. So I think then probably the percentage of direct negotiation may be even higher than it is reported.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, I need to wrap up the session, and I want to give an opportunity both to Alan and Tansri once again. So I'll go to you first, Tansri, to make any other comments. But I'll just want to put one question in there, which is, what is the barrier to greater level of transparency from particularly, I think, the Ministry of Finance in terms of disclosing the direct negotiations? As Uni indicated just there, the My Procurement website, the most recent project on there is from 2017. So what are the barriers to achieving that transparency? So feel free to answer that question, or if there's any other points that you want to make in conclusion, then please also do.
Well, I think the barrier is political courage, because when you deal with the direct negotiation, usually it is a private sector entrepreneur who comes up to the minister, who says, I have this project, and I would like you to submit a proposal for the government to approve it. And normally he will ask for secrecy, confidentiality. He's afraid that if somebody knows about it, he will copy the same idea, make some changes, and so the original proposal will say, I can't have it because my partner in London or my partner in Singapore, Hong Kong, will be very annoyed with me. This is our exclusive right, our exclusive knowledge. We want to keep it secret. So all kinds of reasons are given to make sure that the project is kept secret, confidential. And if the minister is his friend, the minister may go along with that idea. So I think it's good that we should have competitive bidding. But as I said, there are certain circumstances where you can't avoid direct negotiation. For example, with the COVID-19, you may have to buy a certain type of vaccine where there's only one producer in the world. So you have to just negotiate with that producer, with that manufacturer. But the government must make sure that it has got all the expertise behind it to advise, whether we are paying the right price. So I'm sure if we have media freedom, freedom of information, parliamentary oversight, those who are implementing the project at the ministry level, I'm referring to civil servants, because they are the ones who process. They will have a certain sense of fear that if they do something wrong, they will be hauled up, their name will be blacklisted. So that's the advantage of having these oversight committees to drive fear into the civil service. So to let them know that there is somebody who will ask them to explain later. I think that will have that will have a lot of impact on how things are done. Because as Munyati and Alan said, the guidelines are very good. If you go through the guidelines, they are really very good. I've read both. Ministry of Finance guidelines for the direct negos, the UCAS guidelines for the PPP project. They are all well written. They must have got professional advice, to write the guidelines. And if these guidelines are followed properly, there shouldn't be any issues. But unfortunately, they are not. They're not complied with. So somebody at a higher level, that is Parliament, I suppose, should have authority to ask them, why are you not following the guidelines? Okay, you have accepted contractor A. Why do you feel that he's the only one capable of doing the job? Why can't you bring contractor B, contractor C? So somebody has to answer all these questions.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much, Tan Sri, and thank you for your contributions and for taking the time with us this morning. So just before we wrap up, Alan, are there any other final comments or reflections?
Yes. Yeah, if I could, Lauren, just very quickly, I think we also need to look at penalties applicable to companies that are unable to complete jobs on time within budget. There are clauses within government contracts, I believe, which specify, penalties, but how much of it is actually being applied? I think whilst a penalty is applied to companies, there should also be a higher standard to government officers who, through negligence or through whatever other reasons, are part of a process where the government loses money. We have had the corporate liability come into force on the 1st of June, which applies to the private sector. I do not see why the same standards cannot be applied to public officials, whereby they can be, if found guilty, criminally negligible for acts which make government lose money. My last point is on freedom of information, which was highlighted earlier. I'm not a big fan of FOI. I've seen how it works in democratic countries. Lawrence, in the UK, I've had discussions with people who have seen challenges with FOI. I believe information that is clearly defined must be made publicly available. So I take the stand that you define what needs to be publicly available to reduce the risk of leakages, audit issues, and corruption. And having said that, we need to publish that information without fear or favor. When information is publicly published for the benefit of the rakyat, for the benefit of other companies who say that they can offer those same services and there's no need for direct negotiations, I believe the system will improve over time. So I believe that is the most crucial part. Publish information.
Thank you very much, Alan. And the last word, Uni, is there anything you want to say in response to any of the points that have been raised by the panelists, or where we will take this research next?
Well, I think I'm just gonna address the last one. We also published another report, Lauren. So we published the result of the roundtable that we did in the past 4 months, in which Alan actually participated, and I thank you for the insight and inputs. So we also published this report online, hopefully within this week. So we want to take up this recommendation to the MOF, and hopefully they will accept these recommendations and include them in the circulars or even in the next procurement legislations. There's the questions about PDP, but I think I'm not gonna touch in that. I will comment in the chat box. But thank you again.
Okay, thank you, Uni, and sorry if I didn't get to all the questions that were raised. So I think it's very clear that even if we accept the need for direct negotiation and we accept that the policies do exist, the question really is how do we ensure they're enforced adequately? And I think we've touched on different mechanisms to do that. We've talked about stronger parliamentary oversight, increasing the accountability of civil servants directly, whether through penalties or through direct exposure to those accountability mechanisms, and through the legislation directly in strengthening that framework, and then crucially providing that review mechanism that provides a very clear avenue for other companies actually to object to the process. So I think that's the direction that we hope the Ministry of Finance will take in strengthening the processes around direct negotiation, and ultimately will take forward in the Government Procurement Act. So thank you very much to all the panelists. Well, I've already had to say goodbye to YB Kian Ming, but thank you very much to Tan Sri Sheriff and to Alan for joining us this morning. Thank you to everybody who participated. And please, as Uni indicated, both the policy paper on direct negotiation and our other report on the wider agenda of procurement reform will be available on our website. So please do feel free to download if you're interested in getting into some of those details. On that note, I'll draw the session to a close. I'll just ask if our two panelists can just hang on for a minute. But thank you very much, everybody. And please do subscribe to our newsletter so that you can learn about future publications and events on this and many other topics. Thank you, everybody, for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you.